Welcome to The Last Ottoman, a podcast series in which we discuss the Ottoman Empire and its legacy today. We are at the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking. My name is David Selim Sayers, and today, on the third episode of The Last Ottoman, it is my pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague Zachary Foster, whose research on Palestine has been making waves for the last 5 years, even though, or perhaps precisely because, he has chosen to take his work and career outside the university. Zach, welcome to the show.
David, thanks so much for having me on.
Zach, let me dive straight in. Your PhD thesis was entitled The Invention of Palestine. And as the title indicates, you place a lot of importance on the fact that the concept of Palestine was, quote unquote, invented. In your eyes, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
So I would say all places are invented. Countries, regions, states, counties, lands, none of these things exist in nature. So the places and the spaces and the lands that we inhabit, they're all invented. And so I think what that means is that you cannot go to a geologist or a pathologist, someone who studies soil, or a biologist or a chemist or a physicist and ask them, what is Palestine? You have to go to a historian or a social scientist or a humanist, because a physicist and a biologist and a chemist, if you ask them, what is Palestine? They do not have the tools. They do not have the analytical tools or the scientific tools to tell you what Palestine is, right? I think what that means, is that it's really the job of the historian and the social scientist to tell us what Palestine is. It's an invention. That's what it is. We made it up. Is that a good or a bad thing? I wouldn't say it's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's just a reality of living in a complex societies with complex identities. I think that, for example, I think that, when you have complex societies, you need places. You need these invented places. Why do we need invented places when you have complex societies? Think of just like any state or any society. How is it you can function in a society without naming places? Like, hey, David, let's meet up in Polanco. Well, if you don't know what Polanco is, then how are we going to be able to meet there? Like, hey, Dave, let's meet up in Amsterdam in January. Well, hey, if that's an unintelligible word to me, then we're just not going to be able to communicate.
Right.
How is it that you govern a place or a space without being able to tell your direct reports or communicate to your commander, hey, we were unable to conquer Palestine. We failed to conquer Lebanon. Or how is it that you can even have a chain of command? How is it that you can conduct operations of a state without dividing that state into different lands or different territories or different counties?
I mean, you're talking about nationalism, or the way what Benedict Anderson would describe as the imagined community, right? On the one hand, but the problem is, of course, on the one hand, we all know that all nations are invented. On the other hand, when you stress that in a certain way, then you might find yourself in trouble because, hey, of course, my nation sort of precedes history. My nation precedes, anything else that's been around forever. So it feels a little bit like there's a little bit of a provocation in your title when it comes to that aspect of nationalism.
You're absolutely right about that, and I would like to get into that in just a second, but let me just make one other quick point about invented identities, because I think there's this perception, as you point out, that there's something somehow problematic or illegitimate about an invented identity. By the way, all human identities are invented. I identify as Jewish. I'm a proud Jew. I go to synagogue sometimes. I make Shabbat dinner sometimes. By the way, Judaism is invented, okay? Human beings invented it. And I'm still Jewish and I'm still a proud Jew. There's nothing wrong with believing and being proud in an invented identity, right? So that's the first point I would make.
Right, right.
The second point I would make, though, is that, I don't think it really matters, right? Like what we call these places. To this question of does it matter that this is an invented identity or an invented place? Well, I don't think so. If we call it Israel, or if we call it Palestine, or if we call it Judea or Samaria, or Eretz Israel, or Bilad Sham, or the land of Canaan, I don't think it really makes any difference at all. I mean, think about, for example, does it matter if we call this Jack Herrera or Sour Diesel or Bubba Kush or Gelato? Like, it makes no difference at all, right? We just made these things up.
Well,
These are just
it might make a difference in sort of how much of a high it gives me, but I'd have to look into that.
exactly right. So we use these words, these strings of sounds and syllables. We use them because we need to use them, because in order for human beings to communicate intelligible ideas from one human being to another human being, we need to use these words that refer to complete inventions, completely invented ideas. And that's the nature of human communication. That's the nature of human language. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think, but however, what I would say though is that this random string of sounds and syllables that we have to arbitrarily invent and create and use, that even though it's arbitrary and thus it should be irrelevant, unfortunately, it is not irrelevant.
Right, right. And I mean, that actually brings me to the second question that I wanted to ask you, because in your research on Palestine, part of your research is actually a meticulous tracing of the different names the region of Palestine has had throughout history. And the question that poses itself there sort of relates to what you were just saying, because why exactly is it so important what we call a place? I mean, you were saying, okay, well, at the end of the day, it's arbitrary, but if I mean, I'll give you a chance to explain, because after all, political sort of actions, political realities get tied to these names, and then it does start making a difference. Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree with you that despite the fact that these are arbitrary strings of words that we use in order to communicate intelligently, at the same time, these arbitrary sounds, these arbitrary strings of sounds that refer to things in the world, even though we've invented them, they actually do have real world implications. So let me just give you a few examples. When Israel conquered the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, it shut down the Bank of Palestine, okay? And then when it was set to allow that Bank of Palestine in Gaza to reopen in 1980, the Israeli army required the Bank of Palestine to change its name. Now, let me ask you, what was so problematic about the name the Bank of Palestine? Well, from the point of view of the Israeli army, it quote unquote endangered Israeli security. You heard that correctly. The word Palestine being used in the name of a bank was endangering Israeli security. Palestine, 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 Palestine. Alert, anyone listening to this podcast, you have 15 seconds to find shelter before you get hit in the face by my saliva. Okay? It's such a ridiculous concept that a word that refers to a space or a territory or land is dangerous, right? But here we are living in this country where, in fact, they're criminalizing the use of a word, of this specific word referring to this land, right? So even though it's arbitrary and that we made it up and that's invented, well, clearly some people think this arbitrary word has like really important implications in the real world.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is one example. If you look at, for example, Chance the Rapper, a very popular rapper based out of the UK, he has a song where he talks about Palestine all over the sound, all throughout the song. And the BBC was showing this music video once, and there was this huge controversy whereby the BBC was bleeping out the word Palestine as if it was a curse word, because they must have had some like pro-Israel pundit on staff who's like, oh my God, like the word Palestine is so dangerous. This is inciting to violence, right? Like, so we live in this world where the word Palestine is being criminalized. It's being treated as a curse word. Yeah, free Palestine from the river to the sea. Mark Lamont said that on CNN and he got fired.
Right.
Why is it that saying the word Palestine is problematic or that it's criminalized? Well, I think the answer is that we live in a world where Palestinian identity, the idea of Palestine, has been delegitimized. It's been delegitimized because you have this very powerful state, the Jewish state of Israel, that has been hell-bent on erasing Palestine and Palestinian identity from memory and from view. And so I think ultimately, like, it's precisely because that we have this state and these people who are hell-bent on destroying an entire other culture's identity that we have to sort of look and ask ourselves, like, okay, well, what is Palestine? Let's talk through this concept. Let's try and understand it.
Actually, one thing that sort of popped into my mind as you were saying this about the sort of erasure of this concept of Palestine relates to something that I wanted to ask you later on, but it ties in much better here. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask that because it relates to the art. I want to say because I don't want to really call it a science, the art of writing history, and in your research, especially concerning the term Palestine, you've come across some very problematic, to say the least, very problematic ways of writing, rewriting, sort of let's say, kind of directioning history that are very one-sided in the way that they account for the usage or the non-usage of the word Palestine, and this from some very, very well-respected and eminent historians. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the word Palestine, for various reasons, I think in part because it has been politicized and criminalized, there's a rich body of literature of historical research trying to understand when people use the word Palestine in history, who used the word Palestine in history, how often it was used, and to refer to what land. And so this has been really the focus of my dissertation research, is really just trying to understand when people use this term. And you could say the term dates to the ancient world. It was used by the ancient It was used by the ancient Egyptians. You find it in hieroglyphic texts. It was used by the ancient, the biblical peoples, the Jews. In the Bible, you have the word pleshet, plishtim. It was used in ancient Assyrian sources. And from the ancient world, it gets translated into Aramaic sources, and then from Aramaic, it goes into Greek and Latin, and then Arabic and all the modern European languages, and then all the modern Western and non-Western and Eastern and non-Eastern languages. And so that's the short part of the story. We could dive deeper into any particular period of history if you're curious. But I would say just one thing I would point out is that I think there's been a tendency among historians to point to the fact that after it fell out of use. So the basic narrative around the historical usage of the word Palestine is that it was used in the ancient world, and then the Arab conquerors adopted the Byzantine usage of the word Palestine. And so in the early Islamic period, there was a province, there was a district in the Islamic states in the Umayyad Caliphate known as the Jund Filistin, or the District of Palestine. And then the argument goes, after the Crusader conquest, the term Palestine fell out of use. It was no longer used at the political level, and so the Crusaders did not use the word Palestine. Neither did the Muslim states that conquered Palestine after the fall of the Crusader states. They did not. The Ayyubids did not use the word Palestine. Salah ad-Din did not use the word Palestine. Neither did the Mamluks or the Ottomans. And so the traditional theory, the traditional thinking was that the word Palestine fell out of use.
Which,
what I try to argue,
let me just interject, right? And the point that's trying to be made here is, if the word Palestine fell out of use, it also did not denote anybody's identity.
That's a very good point, David. You're absolutely right. The whole reason why this whole body of research exists in the first place, of all these scholars like the whole reason this body of knowledge exists in the first place, and the whole reason you have scholars like Bernard Lewis writing history papers, basically saying there was no Palestine, this word was never used, is precisely for the reason you just stated. It's that, wow, wouldn't it be great if there was no Palestine? Wouldn't that be great for the Zionist story if they showed up to a land that was uninhabited, right? A land for a people without a land, right? That's the Zionist narrative.
Yeah.
And so they're hell bent on trying to basically show that there was no Palestine in history. So I think that is the context within which I'm writing the history of the usage of the word Palestine. And by the way, like, there's nothing polemical. There's no political implications today. In other words, the history of the usage of the word Palestine is not politically relevant. Okay, if people in Palestine use the word Palestine in the 15th century or the 18th century or the 13th century, I don't understand what that has anything to do with home demolitions in East Jerusalem in 2022. Okay, well, it's just not relevant.
Well, right. I mean, it's not relevant unless you are on a some kind of quest to weaponize history in order to sort of justify political projects that are happening at the moment, where you are going to construct a certain version of history in order to best serve your political needs at the moment. Zach, how does that make you, I mean, as a historian, right, how does that make you feel about the discipline of history when you see in action how sort of very well respected historians like Bernard Lewis weaponize history like this?
I think it discredits the entire enterprise of history in the first place. I think that is the risk. I think when historians allow their political ideologies to color not just their approach to writing history, but literally like their conclusions itself, what they, because history is not just about framing. It's also about like being honest about the evidence. And I do think that, historians are oftentimes not honest with the evidence. I think that historians really need to ask the question I think Bernard Lewis arrived at the conclusion first that there was no Palestine because that was what he wanted to show. And he went back in history and found shards of evidence that supported that conclusion he had already come to. And I think this is extremely problematic. And I think this is, by the way, very common in history, is that you have so many historians that start off, they're like, I want to argue that, the violence in Lebanon in the 1860s was a result of Western impact in Lebanon from the early 19th century onwards. Like, that is what I want to argue because I'm hell-bent on showing that all the problems in the Middle East are a result of Western impact. Okay.
Right.
Now, maybe that might be true, by the way. And I'm not making an argument one way or the other. What I'm saying is if you start with that a priori belief and then go into the sources looking for shards of evidence that support that conclusion, that is extremely problematic. And it's the opposite of how you're supposed to write history.
But you're also saying that is sort of very often the case. That is very often the reason that people write history. I mean, history, this is maybe, I mean, if you told somebody to write a nationalist history, they wouldn't know how to do it otherwise.
I think that's exactly the point, right? That this is essentially a nationalist version of history. When you start with the ideology and you say nations have rights to land. Well, if I start with that ideology and I'm going to write my history from the point of view that like the nation has certain rights, that's an ideology. We might say that nations have no rights. Why should a nation have right? I mean, that's not obvious to me. That's not like part of the natural order of the world, right? That there are these nations and nations have rights to states, right?
Even the first part of your sentence, there are these nations, right? Let's start with that part.
Exactly. Like who said nation should be the unit of analysis in the international order that we live in?
Right.
Maybe it should be some other unit of analysis. Maybe it should be a tribe
or
an individual.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right? So I thank you Zach for sort of really provoking these questions. Not just about the specific case of Palestine, but the way that Palestine, the example of Palestine, this is one of the reasons why it shouldn't just matter to people who are directly implicated in this conflict, because it tells us something about the broader projects, the broader political projects of our day, and the way that they influence the way that we perceive history. I wanted to get you to talk about one specific example which I found exquisite in your research, and that is the example of a specific naming of Palestine as southern Syria, because you have made a very interesting sort of twist identified a very interesting twist in the way that the word southern Syria has been used. It has been used by different groups for different purposes. Could you just give us that anecdote or give us that example?
Absolutely. So the phrase southern Syria, if you just Google that phrase, you're going to find all kinds of interesting op-ed pieces from Jewish propagandists and Zionists and pundits telling you that there were no Palestinians. They always called themselves Southern Syrians. Of course, the reason why Zionists are hell-bent on and trying to tell you that these Palestinians were always Southern Syrians, again, is because they're nationalists and they believe that the state, Israel belongs to the Jews. And so wouldn't it be great if these Palestinians were actually just Syrians, right? Like then there is no Palestine national identity and Palestine homeland that we have to compete with, where it's all ours. These people should just go to Syria. Now, that's sort of the reason why this narrative got popular in the first place, right? That they started with the conclusion that Israel belongs to the Jews, and then went into history looking for these traces of evidence that the native inhabitants, the Palestinians, actually were Syrians, right? So that's the thinking behind how the propaganda got popular. But historians, of course, don't start with, or shouldn't start with, ideological points of view. They should start with they should start with the facts and just sort of look to see what people actually called themselves. And if you go and look at the evidence, what it tells you is that before the year 1917, the phrase Southern Syria does not really appear in Arabic ever. Okay, so I found the phrase Southern Syria maybe 2 or 3 times in the course of scanning maybe tens of thousands of newspaper articles and journal articles and books and manuscripts in Arabic before 1917. Okay, it just doesn't appear in Arabic sources. In 1918, everything changed. Everything changed in 1918. So the question is, what happened in 1918 such that over the course of the next 2-year period, you start to see this phrase, Southern Syria, Surya al-Janubiyya, in Arabic, right? I'm talking about Arabic sources right now. And you start to see the phrase Southern Syria appear everywhere in Arabic. Now, what happened was that, the Ottoman Empire joined World War I, tragically. And so, that pitted them against the British. The Ottoman Empire joined, obviously, the German side of the war effort, which pitted them against the British. The British had occupied Egypt already in the 19th century. And so over the course of the war in 1917, in the fall of 1917, the British invaded Palestine. They conquered Palestine they entered Jerusalem in December 1917, conquered all the rest of Palestine in early 1918. And so by early 1918, the British are now entirely in charge of Palestine. And meanwhile, you have the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who is in communication with the British in Egypt, and you have the Sharif Hussein, the Hussein McMahon correspondence, and so they're plotting to revolt against the empire. The British send Lawrence of Arabia. He goes with these Meccans, and they basically revolt against the Ottomans. They take their army up to Transjordan and establish a state, an independent Arab kingdom in Damascus. Okay, after 400 years of Ottoman rule in Arab lands, you now have an independent Arab state in Damascus, and at the same time, you have the British in control of Palestine. The same British, by the way, who just a few months earlier had declared their support for a Jewish state in Palestine via the Balfour Declaration. Now, that is the setup here. So let me ask you this question, David. If you are a Palestinian sitting in if you're a Palestinian sitting in Jerusalem or Jaffa or Hebron or Nablus or Jenin, and your two options are, do I want to be ruled by a Zionist supporting British military regime based in Palestine, or would I rather join a semi-democratic, independent Arab kingdom based in Damascus? Which choice would you choose, David?
Well,
it's not even a choice. I mean, do you want to be subject to colonial rule that is hell-bent on turning your land into a Zionist paradise, or do you want to be subject to a semi-democratic, independent Arab state? And I think the answer is obvious. And so you have all these Palestinians in Palestine saying, no, we're not Palestinians. We're Syrians. We're Southern Syrians. In fact, Palestine never existed in history. It was always called Southern Syria. And so that's the origin of the reason why you have the phrase Southern Syria emerge in history. And so what happens is after 1920, the French violently overthrow that independent Arab kingdom in Damascus. So, that kingdom is gone. But of course, throughout the 1920s and 30s, the memory of that kingdom, the memory of having that independent Arab regime, semi-democratic regime in Damascus, that memory persists. And so for all these reasons of nostalgia, you have all these Palestinians, even throughout the 1930s and 40s, wouldn't it be great if we could reunite with that Syrian Arab kingdom and create a greater Syria, Bilad-e-Sham, unite the Arab peoples of Syria and Palestine against this colonial division to divide us and conquer us. So this persists. And so you have these Arabs. It's a minority viewpoint, by the way, that most Palestinians in Palestine are sober and realize that the British are not going to hand Palestine over to the French Syrian government, who's going to hand it over to some Arab state there that will replace the French government. But most Palestinians are sober enough to realize that's probably not going to happen. But there are, of course, idealists who continue to talk about the dream of Palestine being southern Syria and having a greater Syrian kingdom. And so what happened is after the after the establishment of the state of Israel, you have all of these Zionists going into history, digging up these anecdotes of Palestinians saying it wasn't Palestine, it was Syria. But of course, it was precisely because of their loyalty to Palestine and their opposition to Zionism and their love for Palestine that they insisted that Palestine didn't exist.
Right. I mean, this is such a classic example of how this sort of naming process and this identity process can be sort of turned around and subverted and then used against the very people who were trying to achieve certain ends by it. I just didn't want to let it go by. Zach, you've taken us actually now into sort of like away from the sort of more theoretical question of naming and into more specific episodes of history. And I wanted to ask you to tie that a little bit to the question of self-determination, because when I think about your work on Palestine, unsurprisingly, it really challenges me to think about self-determination. And I find that we have, with the case of Palestine, a very interesting sort of succession of different regimes within which we can consider the concept of self-determination. On the one hand, we have the Ottoman Empire, which, as you said, was in charge for centuries. And the Ottoman Empire, of course, is an agrarian empire, and we know that with an agrarian empire, the main goal is, okay, we leave the local population alone as much as we can. We don't really want to interfere with the way that they produce things for us, because else we won't have anything to tax, right? So we're going to leave them sort of to their own devices as long as they're not rebelling and as long as they're not paying their taxes, right? So even though you are ruled by a sort of empire, there is still the fact that that empire doesn't necessarily make itself felt so much in your day-to-day life. And then you have the British Empire that you were talking about, which is a very, very different kind of animal, because it's an industrial empire. An industrial empire does not depend on your local production. It's not trying to tax your local production. So the industrial empire gets to interfere with your society and with your identity in a way that an agrarian empire would never dream of doing. And finally, once we sort of trash all of the empires, we still have the question of the nation state. So, for example, the Israeli nation state, where you have as you were putting it already, the famous claim to self-determination. But then again, with the nation state, the question poses itself, like, who is the self that does the determining, right, in the self-determination? So with Palestine, interestingly, we have all three cases, right? We have the agrarian empire, the industrial empire, and then the nation state. So how would you compare, maybe you could walk us through these three scenarios a little bit and how they would have sort of affected the self-determination at a local level?
It's a very profound question. We're really getting at, like, what is the source of legitimacy for any given state? And I think over the course of the past 120, 30, 40, 50 years, international law has developed, and international law has a lot of opinions about that. And generally speaking, I actually support much of international law. I think it's a tremendous step of progress for humanity that all of these states around the world are developing a consensus around how these states ought to interact with one another, what ought to be some guiding principles of those interactions. For example, just the idea that you shouldn't invade your your neighbor. We can think of some contemporary examples of that happening, right? But that is an idea that is based in international law, right? That a state has no right to invade the sovereignty of another state. So international law is, generally speaking, a good thing. Now, of course, that's the setup to what I'm about to say, which is, like, for whatever reason, this idea of national self-determination has also gotten popular as a principle within international law. And this, to my mind, actually makes no sense whatsoever. And so I do want to get into the details here, because we have this idea that you've heard it over and over again in the case of Israel-Palestine, 2 states for 2 peoples, right? This principle, you've heard every American senator and congressperson repeating this idea. it is the accepted framework for trying to, within the United States at least, and probably Europe and many other places in the world, by the way, including many places in the Arab world, such as the Arab Initiative that was passed in Saudi Arabia in 2003. So there is this principle that is generally accepted. By the way, it's also accepted by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. They all accept this idea that, you know, there will be two states. One of them will be a Palestinian state, and one of them will be a Jewish state. And by the way, this is the principle that guides so much of international law. And I think, honestly, like, this principle makes no sense to me. Now, let me sort of get into a little bit more details. The first thing I would say is that I was looking up this concept of self-determination. So I am not a historian of Germany. I'm not a historian of Europe of the 19th century, David. So maybe you can help me out here and fill in some of these details. But it turns out, you know, and again, this is not really my area of expertise, so I'm venturing a little bit far out here, but, you know, it appears as if there's some literature that suggests that actually the concept originated in, guess where, of all places, Germany. Okay, so let me just say that, you know, anytime, you know, Germans develop in the 19th century and 20th century, that we would be basing our concepts around international law. We'd be basing concepts around peoplehood, you know, race, ethnicity. We would use, you know, German ideas to understand how we should base the international order. It's a little suspect, if you ask me. Okay, you know, and I don't know, you know, how it is that, you know, this concept in Germany at least led Germans to say, aha, we need German self-determination. I don't know how that evolved from, we need German self-determination, Germans need to be in control of their own destiny. I don't know the exact ways in which that evolved and transformed into, Germans should be not just in charge of their own destiny, but they should be supreme. You know, they not only their own destiny, but other people's destiny, right? They are destined to take over the world, to control the Poles who are of an inferior race, right? So I think the problem is, as soon as you say that the source of legitimacy for the state ought to be a group, that you use a group's identity, the nation, let's say, as the basis for saying, you know, this group has the right to self-determination, I think that leads down a very, very dangerous path, because it's a very fine line between saying my group ought to have self-determination to then saying my group ought to be supreme. And I do think that is a very,
because the thing that you're doing then, okay, if a nation should have the right to self-determination, then what we need to make sure is to prove that the people that we want to invade or colonize or dominate, to prove that they are not nations, right? This is the whole sort of Fanonian arguments of sort of colonization, that you sort of that you deny the existence of the nation, right?
So that's a great point. Like, this is exactly why Israelis, Jews, do not even want to call these people Palestinians, right? Like, if you go to Israel, Palestine, if you go to Israel and you know, go to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Haifa and ask an Israeli Jew, you know, who are those Arabic-speaking peoples who live next to you? They would say they're Arabs. They're Arab Israelis. They're not Palestinians, right? Even, by the way, many Arabs within Israel, many Palestinian Arabs who carry Israeli passports will tell you the same thing. And in fact, for the same reason, because they want to blend in, they want to have a normal life, they don't want to be politicized. So by the way, like, but I think that the question really is, you know, when you look at a state and you look at a nation state versus a non-nation state, and you ask yourself, like, which of these states, like, which of these states make more sense? Like, does it make sense that the laws related to things like who gets to immigrate, who can marry who can divorce who can buy land, who can go to medical school, who can rent an apartment, who can build a home, who gets a permit to drill a well? You know, let me ask you this, David. Does the fact that you're Jewish or Palestinian, should that have anything to do with who you get to marry or who gets to build a home? I mean, if you're like racist, I guess it probably matters, but like, why should you say the primacy of a state and the rights that the individuals in that state have, that that is dependent on your national identity? I mean, isn't that super racist? Like, if we just replace national identity with racial identity, isn't that like apartheid and like racism, like slavery and, you know, Jim Crow? Like, isn't that like really, really like, and I don't really understand the difference between race and nation here. Like, these are just invented categories we just made up, right? White people and black people, those are no different than Israeli people and Palestinian people. They're all completely invented. And so if you just say this invented group, we're gonna base your rights on whether or not you're part of this invented group. That makes sense to you, David?
Right.
Sure as hell doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. And Zach, I just have to interject here. I love the way that you take a specific example, the example of Israel-Palestine, in order to conclude not just something about that example, but in order to go from that to some of the sort of more basic principles that we take for granted without even sort of asking ourselves why we should take them for granted in the first place. I want to sort of follow up a little bit on the kind of Ottoman side of things, because with the Ottoman, when you go into the Ottoman Empire, when you go to that sort of aspect of Palestinian history or history in general, you get, of course, a very different kind of model. I mean, of course, I'm not saying that the Ottoman model I'm not saying that it was better. I'm just saying that it was different, right? Different in the sense that there was within the system of empire a certain degree of self-determination going on, because local communities based on sort of religious belonging, religious identity, etc., they had certain legal privileges or rights, or they were able to sort of make some sorts of legal decisions among themselves without going to the Ottomans for that, and had their own courts, had their own education opportunities to a certain extent, weren't forced to assimilate into a master language, etc., etc. I'm not, again, I'm not saying it was perfect. I'm not saying there was never ever any forced conversion. I'm not saying that there weren't different levels of taxation, etc., etc. But this sort of ruthless homogenization that is a part of the nationalist project is sort of by its nature not a part of what the agrarian empire sets out to do. And you, Zach, you are actually someone whose travels have taken him not just into the region of Israel-Palestine, but in order to understand conflict, in order to understand sort of this kind of tension, you've also been to the Balkans. You've also spent time in the Balkans. Now, this might not seem very connected to most people who don't know about the geography of the Ottoman Empire, which actually included both regions. Israel, Palestine, and the Balkans alike were part of the Ottoman Empire. And in these regions, you find somewhat similar tensions, somewhat similar conflicts. Could you sort of maybe somehow bring together a region like the Balkans and a region like Israel-Palestine with respect to how their current issues are related to the Ottoman Empire?
I love that question, David, because I think you're absolutely right. I think that generally speaking, people do not realize that many of the things happening in the Balkans today are quite similar to many of the things that are happening in the Middle East today. And I think the story goes something like this. You had this Ottoman Empire. You had dozens and dozens of different ethnic, national, religious groups. It's the 19th century. It's the age of nationalism. The French, the Germans, the Italians, they're all talking about how nations have the rights to states, right? This is what we were just talking about, national self-determination. This is the heyday for the idea that nations should have their own states. And of course, this impacts the Balkans, as I'm sure many of our listeners know. And you have these nations in the Balkans: the Serbians, the Bosnians, the Croatians. They're all claiming their nations, and they have the right. The Bulgarians, right? They're all claiming their nations, and they have the right to self-determination. And so that leads to all of these wars in the Balkans, and that leads to all of these in the post-World, in the post-World War I period. That leads to the rise. So in the 19th century, that leads to all these independent nation states. And then the same thing happens in the Middle East, right? You have the Arabs, you have the Turks, you have the Armenians, you have the Jews who end up pursuing a Zionist program. So you have the same thing happening all across the Middle East. And so I think in the aftermath of World War I, when many of these former parts of the Ottoman Empire are either colonized or they become independent states, you end up having similar problems. And so, for example, right, like you have, just to take, one example of what happens in Serbia. So you have the Serbs, they have their own nation state, and, they're interested in expanding their nation state to other parts of their historic homeland, right? Like, Kosovo was apparently was part of the, ancient Serbian kingdoms. And, oh, the Battle of 1389, right? Like if you ask your average Serbian today in Belgrade, what do you think of Kosovo? Your average Serbian nationalist, well, Kosovo is an integral part of the historic Serbian homeland, right? To people who are more familiar with Israel Palestine, that'll probably sound pretty similar to an Israeli nationalist saying Hebron and Jerusalem, and these are historic parts of the Jewish kingdoms in the ancient world, right? So whenever you have, so I think whenever you have these empires that break up, you end up seeing similar things play out in the states that gain sovereignty, especially the nation states that gain sovereignty in the ruins of the empire.
Right. I mean, in that respect, I think the sort of this connection between the Balkans and the Levant, the Middle East, it also sort of helps us to sort of deconstruct this idea that Eastern history and Western history sort of play out in these, somehow fundamentally different, civilizationally different ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many similarities. I mean, don't get me wrong. Obviously, like Israel Palestine has its own, unique history. Like Israel Palestine is a textbook example of settler colonialism, which, by the way, I think looks a lot more like what happened in the United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa. Like that is a much better example, I think, for understanding the history of the Zionist movement. In fact, you might even say that Zionist movement is actually an archetypical, if you have ideal types, right? This concept of like there are different ideal types of movements, and you would even say that actually, if you say a settler colonial movement is a movement where the settlers abandon their homeland, they give up on their place of origin. They say, this is not our home. We're going to move and create a new home somewhere else. We've severed ties with our home country or our home empire. And I think Zionism is the most extreme version of that. Right? If you compare it to, say, the British, the settlers in colonial America, right? Like many of them kept their ties to the motherland, and they the worst. I mean, obviously the majority view was that by the 1760s we want to break away, but like many American colonists wanted to preserve that connection to the homeland. But nevertheless, that was the settler colonial case. Whereas in the Zionist movement, by the way, it was even more extreme ideal type, where the Zionists were explicitly renouncing their former citizenships. They were rejecting their estate of existence in their former countries, and saying, no, we want to reinvent ourselves and build a new state in a new land, right? So it's actually really a perfect example of settler colonialism. Right. So in that case, actually, it's obviously very different from the Balkans, where you don't exactly have that kind of settler colonial state coming in and moving in. Right. But of course, you do have mixed populations, and so I think whenever you have mixed populations, and then you have nation states that come into existence on top of those mixed populations, you see similar problems emerge.
Right. I mean, the situation where you basically you have nations without states and existing within some kind of larger political enterprise, but just as I don't know, cultural or ethnic or linguistic nations, rather than as something that is tied to a political apparatus in a territory. And then after hundreds of years of coexistence, obviously it becomes very difficult to territorially separate those without resorting to some kind of genocidal action. I mean, on paper, it's all very nice to say that each nation should have its own state and that should have its own territory, but the only way that's going to work in the real world is you either assimilate or expel or exterminate populations that have come to interact and sort of coexist and live together with each other for hundreds of years. And this is why I feel that in the sort of former Ottoman lands, you have this sort of chain of genocides that starts with something like the Armenian genocide during World War I and goes all the way to what you were describing, the Bosnian genocide, and from there onwards to things like the Yazidi genocide by ISIS, etc., etc. It's all part of the same story of trying to forcibly separate things, nations, populations, whatever you want to call them, that have sort of grown into each other over hundreds and hundreds of years, where they were sort of ruled by the same political apparatus that didn't kind of get all too involved in how those people were defining or determining themselves. Zach, what I wanted to, I mean, the fact that you are somebody who has this perspective from both ends of the Ottoman Empire, I mean, it speaks to the fact that you, as a historian or as somebody who's involved in area studies, you haven't just sat at your desk and read the books about, or whatever, listened to the programs that explain the area, but you've actually spent a lot of time in the area itself, and in fact, you've sort of thinking about what you've talked about regarding your formation on different platforms. I've come across sort of three main things that have made you who you are as a historian and as a thinker. Firstly, of course, you have the books, of course, you have the book knowledge, but then you have the travel and you have the interpersonal contacts. And I just wanted to ask you, as a practitioner of history, as somebody who researches and who talks about this, what is the relation between these three things? Because I can imagine that over the course of your sort of development, there must have been some tension between the book knowledge and the personal experience.
Yeah, I think at first glance, you might say that history writing can be done by anyone without having to meet any Palestinian. You could write the history of the Palestinian people, let's say, in the 19th or early 20th century. At first glance, you might say you could write that history without meeting Palestinians, ever traveling to Palestine. I think at first glance, you might say that that's obviously possible, but I think in reality, that's just not how it works. And so just to share a few examples of what I mean by that, how is it that you can even write Palestinian history in the first place? What sources are you able to even get access to? Well, if you're just using, published materials, well, sure, okay, maybe you can find those in Western libraries, or you can find those in the Israeli National Library, or you can find those maybe in, in certain archives that are accessible to the public. But by the way, if you're Palestinian, you can't access the Israeli National Library in Western Jerusalem. If you're Palestinian in the West Bank or Gaza, you do not have access to Western libraries. You probably don't have great access to paywalled materials, right? So already we see that who you are, what your passport is, where you're allowed to travel to, all of these things do have a tremendous impact on what kind of history you're even going to be able to write. Because your identity, who you know, it has a huge impact on what you have access to as a historian. And so, for example, when I was doing dissertation research, I wanted access to all these private libraries, private collections. And so I went to the Khalidiyya Library in Jerusalem. And guess what? Had I not spoken Arabic, there's no way I would have gotten access to that library. The reason I was given access, by the way, was because they would mistakenly confuse me for a member of the Khalidi family. There was literally a misunderstanding that I neglected to correct. I was like, all right, these people think I'm like a Khalidi. All right, let's just run with this. And it worked, and I got access to the library. But that's just like one example, right? But if you look at the acknowledgement sections of the best history books written on Palestine, think of Bashar al-Dubani's Merchants in Nablus from 1700 to 1900, right? He talks about going from door to door, literally knocking on people's doors in Nablus looking for private papers. If you ask Salim Tamari, who is one of the most brilliant historians of Palestine today, I don't know how he does this, but he manages to find these unpublished unpublished memoirs, unpublished diaries of all these Palestinians, Wasif Jawhariya, Arif al-Arif. He's finding them and publishing them, right? So, obviously, who you are, who you know, who your friends are, who your contacts are. Are you able to travel? Where are you able to travel to? All of these things impact what kind of history you're even going to be able to write in the first place. Yeah, and those are sort of the obvious examples. Maybe you might even go a step further and say, even, oral history is another, by the way, interesting kind of history that has been a significant, really important in the case of Palestine, precisely because the Palestinians do not have a national archive. They do not have a repository of their collected histories, be them written or oral. And so you have a lot of very important history that has been written on Palestine using oral history. Another example, I would say, is that even merely what you choose to write about, what topic are you interested in studying in depth? that is obviously going to be impacted by who you know. Who are your contacts? Where are you traveling to? What things are piquing your curiosity today? Because I do think that, history, I like I said, you cannot start with your conclusions when you're a history, but I do think you want to be aware of what people today care about. What are people interested in today? And I do think you need to talk to people. You need to understand where people are at. What are their biases? What things do they believe? And then if you know what your average Palestinian or Israeli Jew today believes about 1948 or about the origins of Palestinian identity or about the 1967 war, like if you have an understanding of what the average Israeli Jew or Palestinian thinks about those things today, that's going to give you some insight into what questions you should be asking, what you should be looking for in the documents. So I do think it actually matters a great deal, even though at first glance you might say it actually doesn't matter.
Right. No, I absolutely agree with you. And you have these, it's not just Palestinian history. You find this all over what we call the so-called area studies. I've had the opportunity to teach and do research at universities in Germany and Austria, where you have these very large Turkish populations, and I work in Turkish studies. And the professors at these universities, often they got into Turkish studies before these significant populations started entering, these Turkish populations started going to universities. So they could basically get away with being Turkish studies professors without even having a very sort of firm grasp on the knowledge. On the language. I'm not saying that they didn't know the grammar, but expressing yourself, actually sort of being at home, sort of the language is a vessel for the culture, and sort of just the dry grammatical knowledge of the language is very different from knowing something about how the culture works. So I often experience these paradoxical situations in these schools where professors whose Turkish was actually sort of, if we talk about it as a spoken kind of living language, their knowledge of Turkish was actually worse than that of their students, and then giving those students bad grade in Turkish because they made some grammatical mistakes.
That's hilarious. By the way, it's the same in Arabic. Like you have many Arabic professors. Certainly going back, I think things are changing now, but certainly if you go back many, many decades ago, to be an Arab or Oriental scholar meant to know Arabic grammar and philology. It did not mean you could have a conversation in Arabic.
Right. And this that sort of brings me to my last question that I want to. I could actually talk to you for hours, but I have to wrap it up sometime. And we've started talking about education, so that's actually a good place to sort of segue into the final question that I have for you, which concerns, again, bringing me back to the topic of your PhD thesis. We've been talking a lot, and you have been talking about a lot on other platforms as well about your PhD thesis, which is weird because usually, as you know, a PhD thesis is something that either ends up rotting away in some corner of some university library, or at best it gets reworked into some book, and the author does their best to make us forget that it was ever a PhD thesis to begin with. But here you are, 5 years after you wrote your PhD thesis, and people are not asking you about your book or about this or about that. They're still asking you about your PhD thesis particularly. So my question for you is actually a double question. The first question is, why is the PhD thesis? Why do you think it is such an embarrassing document for most academics? And why is yours not? What did you do that made your PhD thesis different? And secondly, a connected question, which brings me to sort of the beginning of our talk, of our conversation, is why do so many people with embarrassing PhD theses actually end up as academics, and why did you not?
David, this question is music to my ears, as you could probably imagine. Just to highlight the point you made, I just want to share one brief anecdote, because I completely agree with you that most PhDs theses are embarrassing. And just to illustrate that point, there was a few years ago, I sent an email to it was the director of the National Institute for the Humanities, I believe, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the NEH. They have these grants that they give to people in order for them to write a popular book. That's the goal, is to get academics in the humanities writing popular books. And so I submitted, I was like, cool, this is right up my alley, right? So I submit this, so I'm emailing the director because they have this provision in the fellowship announcement that says something to the effect of, you're not allowed to apply for this fellowship if you're planning on turning your PhD thesis into a book. Like, that is disqualifying you from this fellowship because Obviously, right? Because PhD theses are all embarrassing, and there's no world in which a PhD thesis could ever become a popular book, right? That was the assumption. And so I asked him, I sent this director an email. I said, look, I'm applying for this, this fellowship. There's maybe 1.5 chapters of my dissertation, which I think are interesting. I think they have popular appeal. And I'm going to expand on those chapters and turn those, let's say, chapter and a half into a full length book. And maybe some of the more academic parts of the dissertation, the other 3 or 4 chapters, would not be part of the book, or would be condensed to a very small section. And he said, look, no, there's no world in which even one chapter of your PhD thesis would be relevant for this fellowship. So the perception of PhD theses from the director of the National Endowment for Humanities, which is the United States federal government's institution for funding humanities research, the opinion of the United States federal government is that 100% of every word of every dissertation ever written in the history of humanity is not worthy of a public audience. Okay, that is the perception that we have today. And unfortunately, I think you're basically right that most PhD theses are embarrassing. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I think the first problem is the word length, is the word count. PhD theses are required to be 100,000 words. I think if you ask any really good writer what the key to their good writing is, it's rewriting and it's condensing. It's pressing the delete key. You want to be economical in your writing. And so what you do is what I did when I reached 100,000 words was I said, okay, well, it's time to start rewriting and editing and cutting and pressing the delete key. I got to 100,000, and after after I went rewriting and editing and deleting, I was down to 20,000 words, and I was like, holy shit! I need to now write another 80,000 words. Actually, that's not true, because if I write 80,000 words, then I'll have to rewrite that and then bring that back down to 30,000. So actually, I need to write 500,000 words, which is just an insane number of words. And so I think the first problem is the length requirement. It is very difficult to write 100,000 crisp, tight, economical. It's very difficult to do that. The second problem, I think, is that academics are not taught to write. I was not given a writing class in graduate school, and I think that's more or less par for the course. I don't think graduate students are taught to write. And by the way, writing is really, really hard. It's really easy to be a bad writer and really, really hard to be a good writer. And then maybe the third thing I would say is academics are taught to write on topics, whereas, say, writers, journalists are taught to find stories. And there's a big difference between a topic and a story. So, for example, identity in British Mandatory Palestine. That's a topic. The origins of a Palestinian identity. That's more of a story. I'm uncovering the origins. That's one example, right? But you could really think through anything, look at any dissertation. The vast majority of them are, it's like, I'm stating the topic of the dissertation, but that topic, it's not inspiring curiosity. It's not triggering my interest. It's not pulling me in with some hook or some catch. It's not a story. A story is supposed to pull you in with a hook. It's supposed to be there's a beginning, there's a rising action, there's a climax, and then there's the letdown, right? A story has phases. It builds up. You're telling me about how something happened, why it happened. You're building me up to some pinnacle, some climax, right? That's a story, and you're trying to explain why something happened. Whereas a topic, I'm just I'm going to explain to you the 4 types of identity that existed in British Mandatory Palestine. There were Muslims. They had a religious identity. They also had a Palestinian identity. They also had an Arab identity, right? That's not a story. And so I think you have, for all of these reasons, I think academics struggle to reach broader audiences. They also are reading academic literature, which is jargon-laden and complex, and again, is not well written itself. And so they're basically being fed with bad writing. And so no surprise that if you read hundreds and hundreds of books for your comprehensive exams, those hundreds of books all being very poorly written, all being very complex, all being about about topics, not stories, then of course you're going to follow in their footsteps and also do all those same things. So I think it's also a legacy problem. And so there's just layers and layers of problems with academic research, especially the PhD dissertation. And so I think ultimately, to answer the first part of your question, apologies for rambling for so long here, but to answer the first part of your question, I think that's why most PhD theses are embarrassing. By the way, there's another reason, which is that, PhDs are taught, like the PhD dissertation is a means to an end for most people. And in fact, in many cases, a PhD student will embargo his or her PhD dissertation for 2 years after it's been written. Now, let me ask you this, David. If you're a journalist, would you write a journal? Would you write an article for New York Times, but then embargo it for 2 years? I mean, just think about that for a second. Like, as a journalist, as a writer, you're trying to reach people. You want people to read what you write. Whereas as a PhD, you want as few people to read this thing as possible. Like, the whole incentive structure is to hide this thing behind a paywall so no one in the world can read it for 2 years, such that maybe, hopefully, that makes it more likely you're going to get a book contract, because ultimately you need that book contract to get an academic job. So there are all these incentives are misaligned. Right. It's built on, and so there's so many problems.
Before you go on to the second part of my question, I'm not sure that you remember it, but I just wanted to point out that this is also, it's implied in what you said, but just to make it explicit, this also then feeds in, this sort of jargonification and these requirements regarding word count, et cetera, they also feed back into this thing where the research becomes inaccessible to normal people. And what that means is that then you have to take whatever somebody like Bernard Lewis says, you have to take them by their word. You have to take it at face value, because you can't really go and access the sort of the research, that the sort of nuts and bolts research that has been done behind the scenes in order to enable him to reach the conclusions that he's reached. So you don't have access to that. So it also becomes not just a paywall, it also becomes a sort of political firewall, in a way, if you want, preventing the regular person from accessing academic work.
I couldn't agree more. It's a tremendous disservice to the public to use jargon, to make your research inaccessible, to reference academic concepts that the average person is not going to understand. I don't think that makes any sense. And I completely agree with you that what you're essentially doing is leaving the field open for these propagandists who are better writers and who do have the ear of public officials, of major of major newspapers and major publication outlets. These people who do not have history at heart, who are not trying to uncover the truth, but who have ulterior motives and who are pushing propaganda, you're leaving the field open for these people. So it's a tremendous disservice to the public.
Right, and maybe that does answer the second part of my question of why you did not end up being one of those academics with embarrassing PhD theses who went into academia.
Yeah, I guess I was answering without even realizing I was answering, but you're absolutely right. I think that we as historians, I think it is our job to understand what it is about the past that people today are interested in, and then do your homework, do your research, learn the languages, get into the archives, find those unpublished sources, find those unpublished documents. You got to get in the weeds, but you also got to answer the questions that people today are interested in. And in my case, in the case of Palestine, there's all this propaganda about the origins of the Palestinian people. There's all this propaganda about southern Syria. There's all this propaganda about the Emperor Hadrian, who vengefully, erased Judea and introduced the word Palestine into history. There's all this propaganda about all these things about Palestinian history. And if I were to take the academic approach of, hey, let me just write some jargon-laden, inaccessible, kind of very much in the weeds, very much, disconnected from these debates of just I think that would be a tremendous disservice, because I think that we as historians have a responsibility to the public. The public is the one funding this research. People don't realize this, but guess who pays for your salary at the University of Michigan? But guess what? It's taxpayers. It's United States tax-paying citizens who are paying for your salary. And guess what? Those people have questions, and it's your job to answer them. And guess what? Even if you're not at University of Michigan, let's say you're at Princeton, a private school, guess what? your salary is even more so funded by the public. And this is crazy for people don't realize this, but private schools get a ton of, I mean, we're really veering off course here, but basically as a historian, almost no matter where you're teaching or where you're doing research, you are being funded by and supported by the public, whether or not you realize it. And so if your attitude is, to hell with the public, I don't need to speak to them, I don't need to answer the questions that you're interested in. Well, guess what? But guess what the public is going to do to you? They're going to start cutting funding to your institutions. They're going to start reducing tenure track jobs, eliminating tenure, and the adjunctification of the entire academia, right? David, I'm sure this is a topic that is near and dear to your heart as well. So I'm curious what you think about this. But yeah, you're basically you're gonna push a death wish onto the entire industry of academia and history reading, which is a tremendously unfortunate thing.
Absolutely, Zach. And I mean, to get an idea of what I think about these topics, I think people don't have to go any further than the PICT website. They can look at the manifestos that we put up there. They can look at why we founded the Institute in the first place, which is exactly for the reasons that you've been describing, exactly because of this disconnect between what it means to be an academic in the humanities today and public responsibility. Something the fact that you are trying to do something that resonates, that has some kind of meaning, some kind of significance for the public. So that is exactly what this is about. So thank you, Zach, for bringing that up. I've already taken too much of your time. As I said, I could talk to you for hours, but I do feel that here I should bring us to the end of this episode of The Last Ottoman, which is a podcast series in which we discuss the Ottoman Empire and its legacy today. We are at the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking. My name is David Selim Sayers, and today I had the distinct pleasure of talking to Zachary Foster, who generously took the time to share with us his insights, not just about Palestine, but also about history and about scholarship in general. Zach, thanks again for being with us today.
David, it's always a pleasure.
If you, our listeners, would like to support The Last Ottoman or the rest of our non-profit volunteer work at the Paris Institute, I invite you to become a member of our community. Membership starts from €3 a month and enables free public lectures, open access online journals and podcasts like this one, fair compensation for our course instructors, and everything else we do at the Paris Institute to create a public space for critical and creative thinking. Membership is easy. Just visit our website at parisinstitute.org. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next episode.